are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the senseless murders of Lindsay Cutshall and Jason Allen. Now, 13 years is how long it took to get answers, but many believe that what we know now may not be the actual truth. Why are there so many beautiful souls being taken from this earth when monsters still roam? By the way, I post so much content like this. If you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. So if you would like to support me in doing so, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and comment something nice down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2004 in California, and a couple in their 20s was actually at a Christian summer camp called Rock and Water in El Dorado, where they were basically the counselors at this certain area, teaching the children stuff about the Bible as well as taking them on adventures. And this couple had the area where they went rafting, and they would look over the kids while they did so and teach them a few things about it, and they really loved their jobs. This was 22-year-old Lindsay and 26-year-old Jason, and the fun fact was neither of them were actually from California where this summer camp was being held. They were actually both from other states, and actually separate states from each other. Lindsay was actually from Ohio. Her father was a minister and she had a very religious family, and Jason was from Michigan and he had a super religious family as well. But they hadn't just met at this summer camp that year. They had actually met 2 years prior at Lindsay's school when Jason had just somehow been there the same time she was there studying, and the two immediately had a connection. It was at the Appalachian Bible College in West Virginia when the two first laid eyes on each other, and it was absolutely beautiful. Lindsay was studying there, and when I say it was love at first sight, you might think that's such a fictional way of looking at it. I'm sure it wasn't like that, but for them, it really seemed to be that way. There was no way after that they were going to live their lives without each other in it. They shared the same views on religion. It was a priority for both of them. They also both loved outdoor adventures, and they also wanted to open their own Christian summer camp when they got a little bit older and had the funds to do so. So their life paths just really seemed to line up, and for the two of them, they knew that that was it. They were set. They had found the person they were supposed to be with for the rest of their lives, and 6 weeks later, they would be engaged. In fact, they planned their wedding really quickly. And the funny thing was, they planned it so quickly, but they were actually going to have it 2 years afterwards. So it wasn't like they were rushing into the actual wedding. They just enjoyed planning it together, and I'm sure looking forward to it was really nice as well. But the actual wedding was going to be in 2004, September 11th to be exact, and it was going to be held at Lindsay's dad's church. They had already had their joint wedding shower, and they planned their honeymoon to be on the river in West Virginia to kind of have like a camping adventure. Like I said, they both loved the outdoors, and they decided it was much better for them and they would have much more fun doing something like that rather than going to a 5-star resort or something of that nature. However, they would never have the chance to fulfill this dream, because on Friday, August 13th, around 7 p.m., they were working at the summer camp, and they decided they were going to take the weekend and go do a road trip. Lindsay had wanted to go see San Francisco before they left California, and they had some time off where they didn't have to be looking after the kids. So that's when they decided to go explore. They took Lindsay's 1992 red Ford Tempo and headed out on a road trip together. They had told everyone they would be back Sunday night around 5 p.m. because they did have to work with the kids that Monday morning, so they weren't going to be late. So when Monday morning rolled around and they still weren't back, the camp knew something was very wrong, and they decided to contact the police immediately that day, and they also contacted Lindsay and Jason's parents. Now the thing was, nobody knew exactly where they were going to go. They had just said that they were possibly going to see something in San Francisco, but they were just going to explore on their own. They didn't have a set plan. That's how they like to do things, but unfortunately, that meant no one could locate them. They also knew that Lindsay and Jason weren't the types to just run away. In fact, their wedding planning was so detail-oriented, they wouldn't have just run away from all of that work that they had put in. Lindsay, in fact, was going to go back to Ohio the next weekend to kind of finish up some of the wedding plans. So that was basically crossed out pretty soon after they were reported missing. They were definitely not runaways, but where were they? After both of their parents learned the news, they immediately flew out to California from Ohio and from Michigan to make sure that they could assist in the search. Unfortunately, like I said, investigators didn't have anything to go on, and they could search the area, they could put their picture out, but other than that, other than searching the entire San Francisco area, which is what they tried to do, there was no way to really say if they, had disappeared from the entire area, because that's such a huge area to search. It would be 6 long days with their parents absolutely terrified, not knowing what had happened, where they were, or if they were ever going to see them again. And now it was August 18th, and it was the next Wednesday. And investigators would get lucky, because there would be another case that was being investigated in the area that would lead to much, much more. And that was that there was a helicopter that was flying over an area in California to assist a stranded man who had hiked up a cliff and couldn't find his way back down. So they were searching over that area, trying to find him, when they were going over Fish Head Beach. And that is when the pilot would see 2 bodies on the beach, and he noticed immediately that they were not moving. He called to the investigators, and he had investigators dispatched who were on the ground to go and see what that was and what had happened. These 2 bodies were lying on a beach in Jenner, California, and of course the pilot and the helicopter continued to search for the man who was stranded on the cliff, but these investigators on the ground were going to these bodies, and they would find that it was a male and a female, both in separate sleeping bags, who were lying lifeless. They had both been shot once in the head and killed immediately. All of their belongings were around them, or it seemed like their belongings, They weren't without anything. There was a camera that would have been worth some money, so it really seemed right off the bat that this was not a robbery. Thankfully, neither of them were sexually assaulted either, which kind of eliminated the sexual assault motive. So the other option they were toying with was maybe this was a murder-suicide. However, there was not a gun anywhere nearby, making that pretty much impossible. They seemed to be the only 2 on this vacant beach that you weren't necessarily allowed to be staying on, but many often did anyways. But they were the only 2 around. There was no evidence showing that anyone else had been there. But if they hadn't killed each other, who had done this and why? Investigators then started to believe that maybe it could have been committed by a hitchhiker who had come to this area and then fled. This beach was known for hitchhikers and homeless to basically stay the night or stay a few nights, even though it was technically illegal and they weren't supposed to be. It was so vacant and no cops or anything, circled the area so they could sleep peacefully before heading on without even being caught. But the problem with this theory was that if this was a random hitchhiker, he was probably not from the area, and if they fled right after, how are they ever going to find them again? During the autopsies, the murder weapon would be found to be a .45 caliber Marlin model 1894 rifle, which is said to be very uncommon in this area. So that made investigators think even more that this could have been a hitchhiker from another area or state that had come through and done this, possibly someone who had done it many times before. But this was a piece of evidence that was not released to the public, and we would find that there was actually a lot that wasn't released at first that I will get into later, because investigators were really trying to keep information away from the public in hopes that if they did interrogate a possible killer and they slipped up and said some of this that hadn't been provided in the news, they would know that they were guilty. You know, other than them just being able to come in and say, well, I just know that because of the news broadcasts, which I think is what happens in quite a few cases, and it can really harm the investigation. There were no shell casings found around the area from the gun, as though the killer cleaned them up, but there also wasn't any footprints or any other evidence really in the area, and this is said to be because of the intense winds that kind of blew everything away. So I mean, I guess these shell casings could have gone in a different direction, but I'm sure that they searched a lot of this beach and didn't find anything. With no leads or suspects, investigators decided that they were going to follow the road trip that they were taking, basically retrace their footsteps. So they started with that Friday night that they left to see if they could figure out as to who they came in contact with, or possibly someone following them, or what kind of things they got into that could have led to them being murdered. And they actually found in the camera that was next to their bodies pictures of them at the Golden Gate Bridge, Fisherman's Wharf, and Alcatraz. And so they were said to be going to very touristy areas in San Francisco and basically heading north. And this would be the direction they would have to go to get to this beach in Jenner. They were actually seen at a village in Jenner that Jason had been seen at prior to this and had gone to before, and many saw them in Lindsay's red car that night, just kind of wandering around, picking up like different things from gas stations, getting actual gas, and they were just seen in the area by many witnesses. By Saturday, they found that their credit cards showed that they had gone to Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, which is a very popular tourist attraction. So that meant that they were still going, you know, to different touristy things, and they were still exploring and doing fun things at this time, and didn't seem to be scared or concerned about anything other than that, or getting back or anything like that. They just seemed like they were on a relaxing road trip like they said that they were going on. And many witnesses actually came forward saying that they had seen them in, you know, little towns, little cities throughout the area, including Goonerville, Sebastopol, and Forestville. And they saw Lindsay's car in these areas. It was also found that they bought hot sauce in one of these places, so it really did seem normal. Nothing was out of the ordinary. But then a witness came forward saying that she had seen them Friday and Saturday. And this was a front desk clerk at a local motel and restaurant called River's End. And this was actually in Jenner, the same place where the beach was. And this woman came forward saying that she believed Lindsay and Jason were the two that had come in Friday night and asked for a room, but unfortunately there was not a room at this time, so they decided to leave. However, the next morning, they would come in for breakfast to eat at the restaurant, and that's when the manager of this motel would talk to them just about how they were doing, to see if everything was going okay, just kind of making friendly small talk. And they were saying that they were super happy, they were just a happy couple exploring, and they would also ask if there was any rooms for that night. I'm sure that they had the idea of going in early to see if they could get a room, but unfortunately it was already booked up once again. And I mean, it was summer, so I'm sure lots of people are exploring, especially in California. And so they basically decided that they weren't going to get a room because there still wasn't a room there. But that is when it's speculated that the manager or the staff of this motel was basically telling them about a beach that they could go to, that they weren't necessarily supposed to camp at, but people often did, and that was this Fish Head Beach. However, it cannot be confirmed that this is where they got the idea to sleep there, or if somebody had ill intentions from this motel that told them to go there and then decided to take advantage of them. But that August 14th, they decided to head down there and stay the night for that one night before they headed back the next day to their jobs. And this is when Lindsay would pull her car into a pullout, basically at the top of this like small hill that you had to walk down to get to the beach. She would pull her car in there, and that is where it would be found when their bodies were found. And there was nothing strange around it, and no sign of, forced entry or a robbery there either. There was actually a hut nearby where they had parked, which was like a visitor's lodge, and you could write in this logbook kind of your experience while you were there, just anything you wanted to write, which I think is a really beautiful thing. But investigators looked into this just to see if they had written anything, and they had. Jason had actually wrote, "As I stir this mac and cheese, I think to myself, what a wonderful life. I've just spent 2 awesome days with my fiancée, Lindsay. Can life ever be so perfect? Only with a person who is so great. God gives me this privilege in life, and he has given me a wonderful woman to enjoy it." There was also an entry from Lindsay herself saying, "The sun is going down in the horizon. All I see is the beams shining on the cliff's face. And I know that God is awesome. I look around and I see his creation all around me." Once again, this was something that was kept from the public. However, all of this would kind of come to light in 2006, 2 years after the murders had happened, when they decided they needed to release more information to hopefully get more information in return, because they still had no idea what had happened to these 2 people who had just slept at the beach and had their lives taken for no reason. So they decided to release all of this information and also a few other pieces as well, including the fact that there was a 40-ounce empty bottle of Camo beer, which is a sort of beer that isn't necessarily from California. It originates in Wisconsin, which is something, they were talking about a possible hitchhiker. Could they have been from Wisconsin? This is something that they wanted to throw out there in hopes that it rang some bells with somebody somewhere. There was also a notebook of poems found that weren't from Lindsay or Jason. There were drawings and pieces of the driftwood, and there was also a very distinctive hat that was found near Lindsay's car. But so far, none of this was traced back to the couple or anybody else. Many of these things were random, and the bad thing was, since so many hitchhikers and homeless people would often frequent this area, there wasn't a way to tell if this had just been left behind by one of them, if it was just kind of trash left there, or if it was more meaningful and possibly from a killer. They couldn't say it was from a killer, but they couldn't say it wasn't, and that's why they wanted to tell people, because it could have a huge effect on this investigation, or it could mean nothing at all. There was also a $50,000 reward being offered at this point, but still, no one came forward. It was believed that these 2 had either died the night of the 14th or the morning of the 15th, so either Saturday night or Sunday morning, and that they hadn't even known that a monster was in their presence, that basically they had died while they were asleep and had no idea this was happening. And in some ways, yeah, that's better. They didn't live in that fear. But in other ways, it just shows how senseless these murders really were. And the people who lived in the area hearing this were absolutely terrified, thinking if this monster could do this for absolutely no reason and just shoot them while they were asleep, they didn't want anyone like that roaming. So they were really on investigators to solve this case. One of the first suspects that they had was actually a drifter who was known to be from Wisconsin, the same place this beer that was found was from. And they brought him in for questioning, but they ended up giving him a polygraph test, and he passed, and they had no other evidence to hold him, so of course he was released. However, they had another suspect that they hadn't really told the public about, and by 2009, this suspect would actually be completely taken off the table, which of course just completely put a damper in this investigation. But this was actually a man who was a drifter, or someone who moves different places all the time, and he was known to this area at the time of the murders. He was known for stealing and carrying around a gun, and his housemates had actually kicked him out because he was behaving really erratic and he was waving around this gun he had, and they were scared of him. So they forced him out. But by 2009, he was 62 years old, and his name was Joseph Henry Burgess. Now, he actually was very religious. Well, he was known to say he was this prophet of God, and that he was basically going to live as a hermit until God spoke to him and told him what to do next. Now, investigators originally had him on their radar because back in 1977, he had been living with a group of people, and I think that they were more like homeless drifters that were just together. And this young couple who weren't yet married joined this group, and Joseph was really angered by this. In fact, he wanted them gone. He didn't want them a part of their group, but the rest of the group was like, they're fine, they're not harming anyone. And they were 20-year-old Anne Durant and 19-year-old Leif Carlson, who 4 days later were found shot to death while they were sleeping on a beach. They were also in their sleeping bags. And after this, Joseph was no longer a part of the group because he had fled. And there was a manhunt that searched for him and could not find him for years. This actually happened in Canada, and the police in Canada believed that he had actually killed himself, and that was why they couldn't find him. However, when the murder of Lindsay and Jason happened in 2004 in California, the Canadian police saw this, and they really believed that this could be connected to the murders that Joseph had done. And in fact, they called the police in California and told them this, but the only problem was they still didn't know where he was. However, 5 years later, when it was 2009, investigators were actually investigating break-ins in New Mexico that were happening at a whole bunch of houses, and when they would go into one, a man would actually jump through the window and charge at them. And it ended up being basically a shootout where they had to take down this man, and he ended up shooting a police officer, and then they shot him. And this was in the Jemez Mountains, and on July 16th, this man was shot to death, and this man was Joseph Burgess. And so they officially could test his DNA, but they couldn't talk to him. However, his DNA was not a match to that of the crime scene of Lindsay and Jason. So they basically had no choice but to cross him off the suspect list. However, many still did believe that he was their prime suspect. But in 2014, it was getting to the point where investigators wanted to solve this case, but there was nothing more to go on. There was no leads coming in. There was just nothing to do with it. And so the team dwindled down to one lone investigator working on it themselves. Thankfully, the families of Lindsay and Jason were dealing with such heartbreak and knowing that these cases might not be solved, but they found a way to cope with their pain and their loss, and they did that by really connecting to their faith and to God, and they believed that, God would solve their case and catch a killer. And they also put together a vigil 9, almost 10 years after this had happened at the very beach they were murdered at. And 60 of their family and friends actually flew in from different places to be there. And this was 10 years after. You expect people right after a tragedy happens to support you, but to know that they were still in the minds of people 10 years later, that means that Jason and Lindsay were loved by so many and affected the lives of so many. Something that I thought was really beautiful was that Lindsay's dad actually kept a ring that Lindsay always wore on his pinky, and he decided to wear it for the rest of his life to remember her. This is thankfully not where the story ends, because this is a solved case. Now, by 2017, 13 years after these murders had occurred, another murder would occur. This time, it was March 14th in Forestville, which is only 34 minutes away from Jenner and from this beach. And it was also one of the places we talked about them going to during their road trip. There was a 38-year-old named Seamus Gallen who was shot to death in his mother's home. Now, he was shot, yes, but in his mother's home, there was only one person. This really wasn't the exact same MO as Lindsay and Jason. So why was this even thought to be connected? Well, you see, Seamus lived at home with his mother and his brother, and it didn't take long for his older brother, Sean Gallen, to be arrested for his murder. But there was no motive for why he would have killed his brother, and there was no altercations beforehand. So why did they decide to arrest a family member? Well, that's because Sean Gallen was well known by the law enforcement, and in fact, he had a criminal record. Now, this was not the first time that he was heard of harming another person or trying to, because back in 2009, 8 years prior to this, he had actually shot an arrow through a car at a man in Gunnerville. And this almost harmed this man. And yes, you heard that right, an arrow. Sean was known for making homemade arrows and spears of all different kinds. But if you don't think that's bad enough, let's dig a little bit deeper. Back to June of 2004, the same year Lindsay and Jason were murdered. That year, Sean allegedly tried to kill a man by a homemade explosive device. And this actually went off and ended up injuring 2 people. People who knew Sean said that he was a kooky survivalist who had strange ideals and fantasies, and he often posted on Facebook about all of these. In fact, he would post paintings, and one even said, "Do you like my spaceship? Am I alone or what?" He was into conspiracy theories and space, and he was known to kind of have a behavior that was quite odd and a lot less mature than his age. He was also said to be out of touch with reality most times, and he even wrote on his Facebook, "People I've never met seem to know me and my deeds. Why, just the other day, as I was picking up my order of fish and fried potatoes, a young kid looked up to me and directly into my eyes and thanks me for saving the world. In English, not telepathy. I immediately recognized him to be from the star cluster." And another one read, "Okay, I think I'm back on Earth." Family and friends said that he wasn't kidding about these statements that he wrote. He seriously believed them, which, you know, when you're talking about conspiracy theories and aliens and all of that, that's fine. That's not something that's for concern, but when you believe wholeheartedly in some of the things that Sean was talking about, that's a little concerning. And he also participated in live action roleplay, and that's where he was said to make all the weapons and why he wanted to make the weapons, but then he would shoot people in real life with them to try to harm them. When they arrested him for his brother's murder in 2017, his Facebook was looked into, and that same day, he posted 11 times. Now, some of these were unintelligible. You literally could not read what they said, but others kind of had an almost sexual motive to them, a sexual fantasy aspect. They said things like sex for the body, and like sex for free, and right sex with your mother. And the last picture he had posted was him holding a homemade spear. Now, if you're just as confused by all of that, don't feel alone, because I am too. I'm not even sure what any of that means. However, I just think it shows his mindset that day was a little bit off and definitely had some underlying sexual motive. However, his brother wasn't sexually assaulted from what I know. So I'm not sure if that connects entirely. Sean and Seamus's mother was actually the one that called in after investigators found her son Seamus deceased. She was actually the one to call in and say that her other son Sean had done it. And after this, he would be charged with felony and possession of a firearm and ammunition, as well as possession of an illegal assault rifle, and he was held without bail. Now, he pleaded not guilty at first, but then he did come around and admit to all of the charges, but he also admitted to something that they weren't necessarily expecting. You see, something that the public did not yet know was that Sean Gallen was actually on the suspect list for Lindsay and Jason's murder even back when it first happened. You see, they had found Sean on a beach in Gunnerville, and he had a loaded gun in the pocket of his camouflage jumpsuit, and when he murdered his brother in 2017, he used the same exact weapon. Investigators began interrogating him about his brother's murder as well as Lindsay and Jason's murders, and at first he refused to talk, and they sent him back to his cell because he wasn't giving them anything. But a few weeks later, when he was waiting trial for his brother's murder, he was sent a note with a security guard, and this was basically saying he was ready to talk. So they brought him back in to the interrogation room to hear what he had to say. And from this conversation, investigators were said to then go out in the Sonoma County area, which is where Jenner is in, and look in thick brush. And this was on May 1st. And whatever they found there was thought to be the #1 reason why he was now their prime suspect. 4 days later, a press conference would begin, and the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office would be talking about the Fishhead Beach murders, the murders of Lindsay and Jason. And this was, of course, 13 years after it had occurred, so obviously something huge was happening, and everybody knew that, so they were listening closely. And that is when these investigators would say that they had found their killer. He was Sean Gallen, and he had informed them of information that only the killer would have known. Now, the investigators talking in this press conference would also read a statement from their families, Lindsay and Jason's families, and it would read, "We are extremely pleased that our children's murderer is in custody where he belongs. We praise the Lord for his capture, and we trust in the due process of the law. We would like to thank the heartfelt concern of the people of Jenner and Sonoma County. We have appreciated your support for this case throughout our 13-year ordeal. We are especially grateful to the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office for their tireless pursuit of Jason and Lindsay's killer. The strong support for us and for the case by the former sheriff, Sheriff Cogbill, and the current sheriff, Sheriff Fuertes, has been outstanding. And the dedication of all the lieutenants, sergeants, detectives, and support personnel of Sheriff's Office investigators throughout the years has totally amazed us. The combination of their humanity and professionalism would not allow them to give up on this case. And when we at times wondered if this day would ever come, the detectives in particular wouldn't allow us to lose hope. To all who have worked this case over the years, we can't thank you enough. You are true heroes to us, and we thank God for you. Finally, and most importantly, we want to thank our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for sustaining us and our families throughout the long journey. We know that we have miles to go before the case is closed with a conviction, but we also know the power and the wonder of God's grace." Now, I wanted to read you that because I think it's important to show that these investigators were the good guys. They were the ones who constantly tried to get this case solved, and I think it's a breath of fresh air to hear investigators like that. We always talk about the ones who were negligent, the ones who could have done better. And I think, we need to not have a stigma of it being that they're always bad, because they're not always bad. Some of them, like the Sonoma County, really fought for 13 years and it paid off. And I just want to recognize them for that. But it was also found at this point that Sean Gallen's family had actually been shielding him from arrest since 2004 of Lindsay and Jason's murders. And in fact, David, Sean's father, admitted that in 2004 he disposed of Sean's guns because Sean had asked him to. And this was like a week after Lindsay and Jason's murders, and he said he did so because he believed his son was unstable. But instead of coming forward, instead of going to police, he just got rid of the guns. In jail, Sean was actually being held in the cells for the inmates with mental health issues, and so some believed maybe his mental health issues forced him to lie about what he had done and that he didn't really kill Jason and Lindsay because he was so distraught over his own brother's death. But in July of 2019, Sean Michael Gallen was 40 years old when he was sentenced to 3 consecutive years for double homicide, as well as 94 years for the other crimes that he had committed. This was also without parole, and the judge said, "It's crystal clear to me you deserve to spend the rest of your life in prison, and then some." But the odd thing was, Sean seemed to have no connection to Jason and Lindsay prior to their murders and no motive for doing so. There was nothing that they could get out of him that could be a possible reasoning for why he did what he did. It almost appeared that he did it because he wanted to. And that's the only reason. It was a senseless crime where two souls who had found each other and filled the world with love and hope and bright lights were taken for no reason at all. Their families actually have a page where they just talk about Jason and Lindsay, who they were before, and just sending them messages, and it's actually jason-lindsay.blogspot.com. If you'd like to go on it, it'll be linked below. But I found a little message from Jason's parents that I thought was just beautiful, because they truly want their stories to continue living on even if they can't. And a message from Jason's parents says, "The case is closed, but we feel the story will go on. We still have opportunities to share their lives with others, and in doing so, testify to our loving God. We continually speak of Uncle Jason and Aunt Lindsay to our grandchildren. Friends of Jason and Lindsay now have children and are handing stories down to the next generation. Campers who were guided by them that summer still talk of how their lives were affected by two counselors. Those who have accepted Christ through the testimony of Jason and Lindsay's lives now share the good news with others. So, friends, the story is not over. Fruit will still be harvested until Christ returns and time is no more. The end of the story will be written by God. Missing you, Jason and Lindsay, and looking forward to being together again. Mom and Dad." Now, I think that is quite beautiful, even if you're not religious, even if you don't believe the same things, to know that, they have found ways to cope with their pain and found ways to continue living when something so horribly wrong was done to their relatives is beautiful in itself. And the fact that they still want to provide that hope and love and light to the world is something that I will always support, no matter what kind of, religion or what you believe in. If it's good, I think that is wonderful. So I hope you guys kind of feel the same about that and are a little more open-minded, because I have seen comments when I do these more religious stories of victims who are very religious. I can get some kind of nasty comments, and I don't like to see those, because I'm not the most religious person, but there's still respect that can be given. There is still love and light, and especially to two beautiful souls that's how they live their lives. But why do you think that Sean did it, or did you even believe that he did it? I mean, do you think he could have just confessed? Because why not? Because he was in there? Because he had mental health issues? I don't really know. Was he someone that was just completely out of touch with reality and thought that he could take the lives of anyone he wanted? And if so, if it started back in 2004, I'm sure it started well before that too, and in his childhood. And it especially makes me think, because his parents covered it up, that he probably did harm people or possibly animals when he was little, and nobody heard about it because his parents didn't want them to know. Or did Sean have a deep hatred for certain kinds of people? Maybe he didn't like their religion. Maybe he didn't like that they were a couple, Who really knows? Or perhaps, he had met them prior that day and they had kind of told him to get away from them, or that he was scaring them, or he was acting crazy, and he came after them for that. I don't know. I'd really love to hear your theories on this, what you think had happened. And I do hope that I could shed light on Lindsay and Jason's story, because it was absolutely senseless what happened to them. And it's awful how many cases like this occur every single year. But I hope you're staying safe. Don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye. By the way, I have an ASMR channel if you would like to go check it out. It's linked down below, and I've been posting a lot just to hopefully help with your guys' anxiety, because it's really helping me to do those videos. So yeah, check it out if it's something you're interested in. Bye!